My name is Richard Tomlinson. I'm 81 years old, and the truth is, I never thought I'd still be around at this age. Not because I have any particular illness or death wish, but because it's a strange thing, outliving your usefulness in the eyes of the people you once raised, once loved with every ounce of your being. There comes a moment, quiet and sudden, when you realize the world has stopped seeing you and started looking through you, like a ghost in your own home. And yet I'm still here, living in the same modest house I bought with my late wife, Margaret, nearly 50 years ago, a little blue ranch-style place in Plainfield, Indiana, with creaky wooden floors, ivy creeping around the front porch, and a lawn I can no longer mow myself. Margaret passed away 6 years ago this spring. Stroke. Quick. Unfairly quick. One moment she was humming Fly Me to the Moon in the kitchen while peeling apples for pie, and the next she was on the floor, her favorite apron stained with flour and something far more permanent. People tell you that time dulls grief. Maybe for some. For me, it simply sharpens the edges in different places. The loneliness becomes more structured, less chaotic, but never truly gone. Margaret was the lighthouse in my world, the compass and the map. Her absence didn't just create silence. It carved out whole chambers of meaning from my days. Since she left, my life has followed a simple, small routine. I wake up early, usually before the sun, because that's when the house feels the most still, and I can almost pretend she's still asleep in the bedroom. I brew coffee slowly the way she did, 2 scoops, not 3, because she said I always made it too strong. I sit at the kitchen table and read yesterday's paper, because it's cheaper than a subscription, and because the news is rarely new, only recycled in more violent ways. I write in a little notebook sometimes. I jot down thoughts, lists of things to do, quotes from books I reread. Lately, the handwriting's grown shakier, though I still recognize it as mine. My son David lives 20 minutes away, though it might as well be across the ocean for how often I see him. He's 54 now, a vice president at a regional insurance firm and always in a meeting or on a business trip or too tired to talk. We were never close, not really, and Margaret was the buffer between us. She understood him in a way I never did. I tried to be a father the way I thought a man should be, firm, consistent, quietly supportive. But maybe that wasn't enough. Or maybe it was too much. It's hard to say when the person you raised becomes someone who looks at you more as a burden than a blessing. Then there's Zachary, my grandson, Zach. 17 years old, all angles and sarcasm, with earbuds seemingly welded into his skull and a permanent scowl etched between his eyebrows. When he was little, he used to call me Grampy, and we'd build cities from Legos and forts from couch cushions. He loved dinosaurs, and I knew all their names. I still remember the way his small hand would curl around my index finger as we crossed the street, like it was the most natural connection in the world. Those moments are photographs in my mind, framed in amber. But something changed, or rather, everything did. Somewhere between age 10 and now, Zach became a stranger. Maybe it was David's influence. Maybe the world taught him that old people are irrelevant, inconvenient, expired. Or maybe I failed to stay interesting, to stay needed. Whatever the reason, the boy who used to crawl into my lap now can't look me in the eye. The last time we were in the same room, he sat across from me at David's kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, headphones in, not acknowledging my presence for a full half hour. When I tried to talk to him, to ask about school or his friends, he muttered monosyllables. Then he stood, looked at me with this vacant, dismissive face, and said, "Why is he even here? He's like a walking corpse." I remember those exact words. Walking corpse. They weren't shouted. They weren't even said with malice. Just flat, like a fact. And then he left the room. I sat there, the air knocked out of me, unsure what hurt more, his words or how naturally they had come. David didn't react. He didn't scold him or correct him. He just shrugged and poured himself another cup of coffee. "Teenagers," he said, as if that excused everything, as if watching your father being called a corpse didn't require acknowledgement. I drove home in silence that day. The roads were clear. the sky cloudy in that pale Midwestern way that makes everything feel like the inside of a photograph. I kept thinking, what am I doing wrong? Am I supposed to be more interesting? Funnier? Is it my fault that I remind them of death, of fragility, of something they can't control? But mostly I thought of Margaret and how she would have handled it. She would have spoken to Zach, gently but firmly. She had a way of piercing through noise without raising her voice. She would have said, "That man wiped your nose, kiddo. You don't get to talk to him like that." And Zach would have listened. Maybe. Since then, things have only grown colder. My calls to David go unanswered more often than not. When he does pick up, it's rushed and distracted. I don't ask for much, just a lunch, a drive, some time. But time is the one thing people seem to guard the most when you're old. And the funny thing is, I have more of it than I know what to do with. I'd give some away gladly, if it meant someone would just sit with me a while. I've grown used to silence, to being invisible. I walk the neighborhood in the mornings, nod to the same retirees, wave at the same dog walkers. I shop at the same grocery store where the cashier calls me sir and never asks how I'm doing. I take my pills, refill prescriptions, pay bills, fix leaky faucets, read books, nap in the recliner. There is no drama to report, no crisis, no climax, just the steady, slow erosion of relevance. But I'll tell you this, just because a man is quiet doesn't mean he's gone, and just because he's old doesn't mean he's blind. There are things I've seen, things I've chosen not to react to yet, but that doesn't mean I've accepted them. Not yet. My story doesn't begin the day Zach called me a walking corpse. It begins the day David dropped him off at my door for what he called a little reset, a euphemism for, I don't want to deal with my own son anymore. I didn't ask questions. I simply opened the door, smiled the way Margaret would have, and said, "Come on in, Zachary." I hoped, foolishly, that those 2 weeks might be a chance to remember each other again. I had no idea that they would shatter every remaining illusion I had about family, loyalty, and love, or that by the end of it all, the only corpse left standing would be the soul of a boy who had no idea what he was losing until it was too late. It was a Thursday morning when David called, which in itself was unusual enough to make me think something had gone wrong. He rarely phoned during the week, and when he did, it was usually to relay information, not to have a conversation. I had just finished washing the breakfast dishes and was sitting at the table nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee when the phone rang with its old sharp jingle that now seemed out of place in a world of buzzing smartphones. I picked up, surprised to hear his voice laced with what I mistook for casual concern, though I'd come to learn that David's concern always had an expiration date and a hidden agenda. He told me Zach had gotten into some trouble again, something about skipping classes, mouthing off to teachers, and possibly even vandalizing school property. There was an ongoing investigation, he said, and a suspension was on the table. "He needs space," David said, not quite hiding the edge in his voice, "and maybe a little structure from someone outside the immediate blast radius." I didn't respond right away, unsure if this was a request or an announcement. "I was thinking," he continued, "he could stay with you for a couple of weeks, just while things cool down here. He always liked it there when he was younger, right?" The silence that followed was tactical. I could feel him waiting, knowing full well I would say yes, because I always did. I agreed, of course, not because I thought it would be easy or pleasant or even because I thought it would help Zach. I agreed because some foolish part of me still believed in redemption, not just his, but ours, collectively, father, son, grandson. I thought perhaps if he came into my space where the walls still whispered Margaret's voice, where books still lined the shelves and the smell of old wood and soap lingered, something might reach him. I thought of showing him the backyard garden, the birds that still came to the feeder Margaret insisted on refilling, the dusty photo albums, the VHS tapes of birthdays and Christmas mornings. I wanted him to remember. I wanted him to look at me and see not a relic, but a man who had once carried him on his shoulders and taught him how to whistle. Zach arrived the next evening, dropped off like a package David didn't want to sign for. There was no warmth to the handoff, just a nod, a tense silence between father and son, and a backpack that looked far too small for a 2-week stay. David barely came inside. "Thanks, Dad," he said, clapping me on the shoulder like a business partner finalizing a deal. "Call me if he does anything crazy." And with that, he was gone. Zach stood in the doorway, tall and lean, wearing a hoodie in the middle of a warm September evening, earbuds firmly in place. He didn't say hello, didn't even acknowledge me, just brushed past with the stony expression of someone condemned to community service. I had made spaghetti, his favorite as a kid, or at least it used to be. When I mentioned it, he shrugged, didn't sit at the table, and instead walked to the living room, plopped down on the couch, and pulled out his phone. I tried to coax him back to the table, but he just said, "I'm not hungry," without looking up. That first night passed in awkward silence. He didn't say much, and I didn't push. I sat in my chair, watching an old black-and-white Western I'd seen 20 times, while Zach scrolled endlessly through whatever digital wasteland teenagers lose themselves in. Occasionally he chuckled at something on his screen, and each time I felt a flicker of hope. But it passed quickly. He didn't speak to me unless absolutely necessary, and even then it was a mumble, a grunt, a one-word sentence wrapped in disdain. I told myself it was just the first night. He was adjusting. Things would get better. But they didn't. The next morning I made pancakes, another childhood favorite, and placed them in front of him at the kitchen table. He stared at them like I'd served him roadkill. "You know I don't eat carbs, right?" he said, tone flat, expression unreadable. I tried to laugh it off, to offer alternatives, but he had already turned away. He spent most of the day in his room, Margaret's old sewing room that I had reluctantly converted into a guest bedroom, and emerged only to raid the fridge or use the bathroom. That evening he asked for the Wi-Fi password and rolled his eyes when I said I didn't have one. "Jesus," he muttered loud enough for me to hear. "It's like living in a nursing home." I did my best to be accommodating, to be open, even when the tension began to mount. I suggested we play cards like we used to, rummy, go fish, blackjack, but he declined every time. I offered to show him old family photo albums, and he replied, "Why would I want to see dead people?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. My throat tightened, and I busied myself with some chore I invented on the spot, unwilling to let him see the crack. Every night he stayed up late watching videos on his phone, the flickering light visible under the door. I heard him talking to friends, laughing sometimes, but never when I was in the room. He didn't once ask about Margaret. He didn't ask about school or family or me. I had become a ghost with a pantry. The real blow came one afternoon, 4 days into his stay. I was in the backyard trying to untangle the hose that had been coiled all wrong. I was struggling. It was one of those moments where age betrays you, where hands don't move the way they used to, and joints complain loudly with every twist. Zach was on the porch, speaking on the phone, not noticing I could hear him. Or maybe he didn't care. "Yeah," he said, "I'm stuck at the crypt keeper's place. It's like living with a walking corpse. I swear, it's so boring here. Like, why is he even alive? Just watches birds and eats soup. No Wi-Fi, no cable. It's like a damn retirement museum." He laughed then. A sharp, careless sound that sliced through me more deeply than I expected. The words weren't just cruel, they were spoken with ease, like they'd been rehearsed or said before. I stood there, the hose limp in my hands, watching my grandson laugh at my existence as if my life had no worth, no color, no story. I didn't confront him. I didn't say a word. I simply turned, walked back into the house, and sat down at the table. I stared at the chair across from me, Margaret's chair, and wondered what she would have done. Probably marched out there and told him off in that steely voice she reserved for injustice. But I didn't have that fire in me anymore. Or maybe I didn't think I was allowed to use it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake listening to Zach pace in his room, laugh at videos, chat with friends. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of my breath and wondering how a child so loved, so wanted, could grow into someone so cold. I asked myself questions I'd asked 100 times before. Did I fail as a father? Did I pass on nothing of value? Did David hate me all these years and just never say it until now, through the voice of his son? The next morning I found that Zach had used my credit card to order fast food and have it delivered to the house. I hadn't given him the card. I'd left it on the counter the night before when ordering groceries online, and now it was gone, the charge sitting on my email receipt like a silent accusation. When I asked him about it, he didn't deny it. He just looked at me with that same dead expression and said, "You weren't using it anyway." That was the moment I understood, truly and finally, that he didn't see me as a person. I was a shell, a prop in a life he didn't want to be part of. I was not Grampy. I was not Richard. I was not even Grandpa. I was an ATM machine with legs, a walking corpse, as he had so eloquently put it. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, is that I had once survived much worse than his contempt. I had survived the death of the woman I loved, the loneliness of years without warmth, the long erosion of being forgotten by your own son. And now, watching this boy, my grandson, take his first steps down a path paved with cruelty and entitlement, I felt something stir inside me, not anger, not yet, but a reckoning, slow and solemn, like the first rumble of thunder before the storm. I wasn't dead, but something inside me had begun to awaken. And I was going to make sure that before this was over, Zach would come to understand exactly who he was talking to when he called me a corpse. The days that followed moved in a slow, uncomfortable rhythm, not unlike walking with a stone in your shoe, minor irritations building until every step aches with something more than pain, humiliation. Zach settled into my home not as a guest but as a squatter with inherited rights, behaving as though he'd been forcibly exiled to a prehistoric world devoid of his natural habitats, Wi-Fi, fast food, and the endlessly scrollable glow of his online kingdom. I began to notice patterns, how he would wait until I went to bed before rummaging through the pantry, how he kept the bathroom light on all night, how he moved through the house with the confidence of someone who believed nothing and no one around. Him mattered. I should have spoken up, I suppose. I should have imposed rules or schedules, offered boundaries, consequences, lectures. But instead I watched him, quietly, almost morbidly curious to see how far the line would be pushed, how much of myself I'd have to swallow before I choked. On the 6th day of his stay, I came home from the pharmacy to find the front door unlocked, music blaring from the living room. Not music, really, just a relentless thump of bass that shook the floorboards like a distant earthquake. As I stepped inside, I saw 2 other teenagers, boys I didn't recognize, sprawled on the couch with Zach, a bag of chips between them and an unmistakable cloud of marijuana, hanging in the air like incense in a desecrated church. The television, which I never turned on anymore, was flashing rapid images of some violent video game, guns and blood and noise and chaos. None of them looked up when I entered. I stood in the doorway for a moment, waiting for acknowledgement that didn't come. When I finally cleared my throat, Zach turned, his expression a mixture of indifference and mild annoyance. "What?" he asked, as though I were the one intruding. I said his name, calmly at first, then again more firmly. "Zachary." The other boys snickered. One of them, taller, with a mop of greasy hair, muttered, "Gramps is mad," followed by exaggerated laughter. My hands were trembling slightly, whether from anger or sadness, I couldn't tell. I asked them to leave. Zach didn't move. "Relax," he said. "We're not hurting anyone." I pointed to the open bag of weed on the coffee table, to the ash marks on my carpet, to the smoke curling toward the ceiling fan I hadn't turned on in weeks. "This is not okay," I said. "This is my house." That last word echoed awkwardly in the room, as if even it were up for debate. Zach rolled his eyes and stood up, stretching lazily. "Fine," he said, grabbing his phone. "We'll go." "Jesus, you're so dramatic." As they filed out, one of them knocked over a lamp. It didn't break, but the bulb shattered, scattering glass across the hardwood floor. No one apologized. No one looked back. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the kitchen with the broken lamp beside me, staring at the shards and thinking about how something could be ruined so completely in just seconds, even if it had stood undisturbed for years. The next morning I told Zach we needed to talk. He looked up from his phone, chewing cereal directly from the box, and shrugged. I tried to explain how I felt, how this house wasn't just a place, it was my life, and that his behavior was not only disrespectful, but hurtful. I used the word hurtful deliberately, hoping it might land somewhere. He blinked, made a face, and said, "You act like it's a museum." "Who cares if a stupid lamp breaks?" I reminded him it was a wedding gift, one of the last things Margaret had picked out herself. "So?" he said, stuffing another handful of cereal into his mouth. "She's dead. The lamp's just a thing." That comment hollowed me out. There are moments in life when you feel your insides rearrange themselves in response to words. That was one of them. He didn't mean to be cruel in the poetic sense. He wasn't that nuanced. But he had tapped into something raw and unfinished, and he'd done so with the casual brutality of youth convinced of its own permanence. I turned away without replying. I didn't trust my voice to remain steady. 2 nights later, I caught him going through my desk drawer in the study. He was so engrossed in what he was doing, rummaging through envelopes, moving papers around, that he didn't hear me at first. When I asked what he was doing, he jumped, then immediately slipped into that mask of teenage defiance. "Looking for a charger," he said. I told him he wouldn't find one in my tax records. He brushed past me on the way out, muttering, "You're paranoid, old man." I checked the drawer after he left. An envelope of emergency cash, $200, was gone. The next morning, I confronted him again. This time I was not calm. I was not patient. I demanded the money back. He looked me in the eye and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." The lie was effortless. I said his name again, louder than I had before. He flinched slightly, not out of fear but irritation. "God," he said, "you're losing it, so you probably forgot where you put it. Maybe you flushed it down the toilet. Happens at your age, right?" I had never raised a hand to a child in my life, and I didn't then. But something in me snapped, not in violence, but in the quiet withdrawal of tolerance. I saw in that moment that the boy in front of me didn't just not love me. He didn't respect me. He didn't recognize me. To him, I was a relic, a dying breed, a placeholder for his boredom and his contempt. That afternoon, I locked the study and moved what little cash I had left into a hidden tin beneath the floorboards in my bedroom closet, a place I hadn't opened since Margaret passed. I stared at her old slippers sitting there, untouched, and for the first time in months I cried, not because of the slippers, not even because of Zach, but because of what I had become in the eyes of my own family. A man without weight, a man without voice, a corpse still occupying space. The spiral continued. The next evening I found a bottle of vodka hidden behind the toilet tank in the guest bathroom. Zach denied it, said it belonged to one of his friends. I told him his stay was over, that I was calling David. He laughed. "Good luck with that," he said. "He's not answering your calls, remember?" And he was right. I had called David 3 times that week, all unanswered, left voicemails, none returned. When I finally reached him the next morning, he sounded annoyed. "Dad, he's just a teenager. You're overreacting." I told him about the weed, the stealing, the drinking. He sighed loudly. "He needs consequences, not another lecture. Just hold on a few more days. I'll come by next weekend." Zach stood in the hallway while I was on the call, smirking as if he knew exactly what was being said. After I hung up, he approached me with a strange expression, almost pitying. "You still think you matter," he said quietly, almost to himself. "That's sad." Then he went back to his room and closed the door. That was the night I began making a list. I called it only to myself, the inventory. It wasn't about money or things. It was about what remained, my identity, my name, my memory, my past, my dignity. I wrote them all down one by one, and next to each I made a decision. Who would get them? Who would lose the right? That was the night I started to remember who I was, not who they saw, but who I had always been, and who, in the weeks to come, I would begin to be again, not because I had to, but because someone needed to remember the difference between being alive and being present, between having a heart that beats and a soul that refuses to be erased. The war had not started yet, but the first shot had been fired. It was on the 10th day of Zach's stay that the scale tipped, not with a scream or a slammed door, but with a sound so soft I almost missed it. The muted click of my safe behind the study bookshelf. I was returning from my morning walk, a simple half-mile shuffle around the neighborhood with my cane and windbreaker, when I heard it. It wasn't the click itself that gave it away, but the timing. Zach was never awake before 10, yet the grandfather clock in the hallway had just chimed 9. I paused on the porch, my key halfway into the lock, my breath held, and listened again. The sound came once more, this time followed by the creak of the floorboard near the bookshelf. That floorboard had always been slightly raised ever since the renovation in '96, and no one stepped on it without making it groan. Margaret used to joke it was our home's burglar alarm. Now it was a confession. When I opened the front door and stepped inside, the house smelled faintly of citrus cleaner and sweat. I moved slowly, quietly, my body stiff but alert. The door to the study was cracked open, a mistake he wouldn't have made if he thought I might return early. I stood in the hallway, heart thudding with something that wasn't quite anger, not yet, and peered inside. There he was, crouched in front of the bookshelf with his phone's flashlight pointed at the dial, a printed cheat sheet beside him. My old fireproof safe, the one I hadn't opened in nearly a year, was in front of him. His face was taut with concentration, brows furrowed in a way I hadn't seen before, like this was the final level of some game and he meant to win. He didn't hear me until I cleared my throat. Even then he didn't flinch, just froze for a split second, then turned with exaggerated calm, like he had rehearsed this moment in his head. "Oh," he said, feigning surprise. "I was looking for paper." I said nothing. I didn't need to. I simply pointed at the printed lock combination in his hand. He looked down at it, then back up at me, smirked, and said, "Guess I got caught." There was no apology, no shame, only that familiar hollow arrogance that had become the armor he wore every day. I told him to leave the room. He didn't move. "Come on, Grandpa," he said, his voice suddenly dropping into something that tried to sound reasonable. "It's not like you need any of this stuff. You don't even touch it. What are you saving it for? You're like, what, 85? I corrected him, 81. But it didn't matter. Numbers weren't the point. To him my age was a death sentence already delivered, and my possessions were carcass pickings he felt entitled to harvest. I told him to go pack his things that I was calling his father. He laughed again, this time not mocking, but derisive. "He doesn't care," he said. "He told me to tough it out. Said you'd probably let me do whatever I wanted as long as I didn't set the house on fire." My stomach twisted. I asked if David had really said that. Zach shrugged. "More or less. He said you're old, lonely, and too soft to be a problem." He stood, dusting off his jeans. And he was right. "You haven't even punished me. You just whine and take it." For a moment, the air in the room felt too heavy to breathe. My own son, speaking through the mouth of my grandson, had reduced me to a limp scarecrow, a relic with no will, no teeth, no spine. I watched Zach saunter out of the room, phone in hand, and I realized then that this wasn't just bad parenting or teen rebellion or the usual generational gap. This was contempt, learned contempt, systematic, inherited, and now weaponized. They didn't just think I was old. They thought I was done. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat in my recliner in the dark living room, hands folded on my lap, staring into the shadows. I thought of Margaret, what she'd say, what she'd do. And for the first time in months I opened the drawer of her old desk and pulled out the envelope she'd given me a few weeks before she passed. "Don't open it yet," she had whispered, with that conspiratorial smile I'd loved so much. "Save it for when you need reminding." I hadn't dared open it before, but now I needed reminding. I needed something. Inside was a letter in her tidy cursive. She had written of love, of memories, of regret over how far David had drifted. "If you're reading this," she wrote, "it means you're facing something I won't be there to help you with. But remember who you are, Richard. You are not weak. You are not invisible. You built a life from nothing, and you made it something. You carried a family, even when they stopped noticing. Don't let them take your name away." I wept then, not the shallow tears of daily frustrations, but the deep guttural grief of someone remembering that they were once seen, that they mattered, that they still did. The next morning I made coffee, poured 2 mugs out of habit, then drank both. Zach didn't come down until noon. When he did, he had headphones on and was texting. I told him we needed to talk. He kept typing. I asked again. He looked up and said, "What now?" Another speech. I didn't yell. I didn't plead. I simply walked to the counter and pulled out the notarized envelope I had retrieved from the safe. He watched with vague disinterest. "This," I said, "is my will." That got his attention. His eyes narrowed. "Okay," he said cautiously. "I changed it last night," I continued. "Everything I have, this house, my savings, my accounts, it no longer goes to your father." "It no longer goes to you?" He blinked. "You're kidding." I shook my head. "It goes to the children's center where your grandmother volunteered for 20 years. Every penny." He stared at me for a long moment, the smirk slowly draining from his face. "Why would you do that?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm done being a background character in my own life," I replied. "Because you and your father have mistaken silence for senility and patience for weakness. You called me a walking corpse, but today I buried what was left of the illusion that we were still a family." Zach didn't speak. He turned, walked to the staircase, and disappeared into the guest room. The door didn't slam. It closed with a soft finality. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew, for the first time in a long time, I had done something not just to protect myself, but to remind them that I was still here. Not a relic, not a bank account, not a walking corpse, a man, and now one with nothing left to lose. The day after I showed Zach the rewritten will, something changed in the air between us. Not reconciliation, not remorse, but a stillness that felt dangerous, like the moment before a wire snaps under tension. He said nothing to me that morning, didn't come down for breakfast, didn't make a sound from the guest room for hours. And when he finally emerged in the afternoon, his usual scowl had been replaced by something flatter, more calculating. He didn't mention the will, didn't ask questions, didn't lash out, and that, more than anything, unsettled me. Silence from Zach was never neutral. It meant he was planning something, or already had. I tried to carry on with my routine, watering the plants, folding laundry, dusting the picture frames along the hallway that still held Margaret's face in frozen, joyful moments. But I kept glancing over my shoulder, waiting for the next strike. It came that evening, not in the form of an outburst, but a phone call. A phone call I wasn't meant to overhear, yet did, purely by accident, as I walked past the open window near the side porch. Zach was outside, pacing with his phone to his ear, voice low but audible through the screen. "No, I'm serious," he was saying. He changed it, all of it, the will. Said we get nothing. Said it all goes to some charity or something. I tried talking to him, but he's lost it. I think he's having, like, a breakdown or something. Maybe dementia, I don't know. He kept talking about being invisible and how we don't respect him. There was a pause, then he continued. Yeah, I'm still here. For now. But if he's losing it, don't we need to do something? I mean, what if he forgets to eat or takes the wrong meds? What if he starts a fire or wanders off? I froze, my blood cooling beneath my skin. He wasn't just reporting what had happened. He was laying a foundation, building a narrative brick by brick, and I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. David, my own son, who hadn't called me back in weeks, now suddenly interested in my well-being the moment his inheritance was threatened. I backed away from the window without letting the screen creak, returned to the kitchen, and sat down at the table, trying to calm the storm inside my chest. They weren't just angry. They were preparing something. The next few days passed with a disturbing civility. Zach began helping with small chores unprompted, clearing his dishes, wiping the counter, even offering to pick up the mail. He asked how I was feeling. He complimented the roast chicken I made for dinner. He offered to show me how to set up a streaming app so I could watch newer shows. On the surface, it was what any grandparent might hope for, connection, a thawing of resentment. But to me, it was like watching a puppet move with strings you couldn't see. It was too rehearsed, too sudden, and above all, too late. I played along, nodding politely, thanking him, pretending to relax, but I watched everything. How he glanced at my pill bottles, how he loitered near the desk drawer where I kept important documents, how he checked the caller ID before handing me the phone. I pretended not to notice that my prescription bottle was slightly less full than it should have been. I pretended not to hear him in the kitchen late one night, whispering into the phone again, saying, "We'll make him look confused. We just need someone to see it happen. I can record it. Just be ready to call someone." I knew what they were planning. They wanted to discredit me, to paint me as mentally unfit, to get a doctor to sign off on my incapacity, which would allow David to petition for guardianship and take control of my estate. It wouldn't be easy, not legally, not without a medical diagnosis, but I also knew how powerful appearances could be. All it would take was a recorded moment, a confused sentence, a staged outburst, and I'd be one step closer to being erased. They wanted to kill my credibility, not my body, to turn me into the walking corpse Zach had joked about. So I began writing everything down, every interaction, every misplaced item. Every time Zach entered a room he had no reason to be in. I started locking doors, hiding my banking information, setting booby traps of the most mundane kind, little folded pieces of paper behind drawers, slips of masking tape over seams of envelopes, to see what had been opened. Each time I found one disturbed, I added to my record. I called my lawyer quietly from a payphone near the grocery store and asked him what my rights were if someone tried to declare me mentally incompetent. He listened with calm professionalism and said, "Mr. Tomlinson, you're doing everything right. If you suspect this is coming, get a clean bill of mental health now preemptively from a licensed specialist. Then if anything arises, you'll have a time-stamped counterpoint." So that's what I did. I made an appointment under the guise of a routine checkup, took a cab to the clinic instead of driving so Zach wouldn't know where I was going, and spent an hour with a doctor younger than my grandson, answering questions, reciting memory tasks, discussing current events, proving my lucidity not with bitterness, but with dignity. When I told the doctor why I was really there, she didn't laugh. She nodded. "It happens more than you'd think," she said. "You're not the first." I received the printed assessment 2 days later, clean, unequivocal, and signed. I made 2 copies. One I placed in the safe. The other I mailed to my lawyer. That same evening I found Zach in my bedroom, rifling through my dresser. He didn't flinch when I caught him. He held up an old photograph, Margaret holding baby David, me standing behind them with a grin, and said, "You really think this means anything now?" I didn't reply. I simply reached out, took the photo from his hand, and placed it gently back into the drawer. The next morning, David showed up. No warning, no call ahead, just the sound of tires on gravel and a knock on the door that was too firm to be friendly. Zach must have texted him. He came in with the forced casualness of someone entering enemy territory under the guise of peacekeeping. "Hey, Dad," he said. "Just thought I'd check in. See how things are going." I knew why he was here. I knew it before he even sat down on the couch and began with, "Zach's mentioned a few things. Says you've been a little forgetful, that you've been talking to yourself, leaving doors open, mixing up names." I listened. I nodded. I let him speak. Then I handed him a copy of the evaluation and said, "If you ever bring up the word guardianship again, I'll sue you for attempted fraud." He looked down at the paper, read the heading, then narrowed his eyes. "So this is how you want it to be?" he asked. "You want to cut us out? Make us look like villains?" I said nothing. What was there to say? They had done that themselves. He stood up, adjusted his shirt cuffs like he always did when angry, and said, "You're making a mistake." Zach was watching from the hallway, arms folded, face tight with fury. After they left, I stood at the window watching the car pull away and knew I'd crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. But I felt no fear, only a strange calm. They had fired their first real shot, but now they knew I had armor, and I had just begun drawing my sword. The morning after David's unannounced visit, the house felt heavier than usual, not just quiet, but weighted, like something in the foundation had shifted during the night. I moved through the kitchen with my usual routine, pouring coffee, folding the newspaper without reading it, trying to maintain the ritual that reminded me I still existed on my own terms. But every action felt shadowed, observed. Zach hadn't come down for breakfast, and I hadn't gone looking for him. We were no longer engaged in the theater of civility. Whatever had once passed between us as the veneer of family had cracked completely, and beneath it wasn't anger or grief. It was clarity. The truth had been spoken aloud. I wasn't wanted. I was considered in the way of something they wanted more. But I had one thing left they hadn't counted on, my voice. Not my legal standing, not my mental state or the ownership of the house, but the story I had lived, the one they had tried to edit with erasure. And I decided, that morning, to speak it. Not in rage, not in courtroom threats, but plainly, directly, with every ounce of the presence they had tried to deny me. I waited until the sun reached the far wall of the living room, that golden, slanted light that used to warm Margaret's reading chair. And then I knocked on Zach's door. He didn't answer immediately. I knocked again, and after a pause, the door opened. He looked like he hadn't slept, eyes red, jaw tight, phone in hand. He said nothing. I said only, "Come downstairs." He followed, reluctantly, and we sat in the kitchen. I didn't offer food. I didn't ask how he was. I simply pulled out the box Margaret had kept under our bed, a wooden chest filled with letters, photos, notebooks, pieces of our life that had meant something. I opened it and began removing items, one by one, laying them on the table like evidence in a trial where the crime was forgetting. "This," I said, holding up a letter, "is from the day your grandmother was diagnosed. She wrote it to herself, to stay strong, to stay sane. And she wrote that she hoped David would understand one day why I stayed home, instead of taking that promotion, why I made myself small so she wouldn't have to feel smaller than the cancer." Zach looked away. I kept going. "This photo," I continued, "is the day you were born. You were crying. Your father didn't know how to hold you, but I did. I had done it once before. I held you until you stopped crying, and you looked at me like you knew me." I laid it beside the letter. I pulled out a school drawing, a crayon mess of colors that spelled out "Grampy is my best friend," and placed it in front of him. "You gave me this when you were 5. You don't remember it now, but I kept it, because you meant it, and because I did too." Zach still hadn't spoken. I looked at him and said, "You want to know why I changed the will?" It wasn't out of spite. It was because I realized what had already died in this family wasn't me. It was compassion. It was memory. It was the part of love that requires effort, not convenience. I kept hoping you'd come back to yourself, but what I see now is that you were never taught to honor what came before you. You were taught to extract from it. He started to speak then, finally, but I held up a hand. "Number, you're going to listen, because if you leave this house today and forget everything else, I need you to hear this. You called me a walking corpse. You said it like a joke. But let me tell you what real death looks like. It's forgetting the people who raised you. It's mocking the sacrifices you didn't even notice. It's looking into the eyes of someone who fed you, clothed you, loved you, and seeing nothing. That's death, Zachary, and it already lives in you." He flinched then, not physically, but inwardly. I saw it. A soft crack in the armor. I stood, walked to the sink, and poured the remaining coffee down the drain. "You don't have to become your father," I said, not looking back at him. "But you will, if you don't start choosing differently. If you think being clever, being in control, being cold is strength, then you'll wake up one day and realize you've built a life no one wants to stay in, just like he did. And by the time you see it, it'll be too late." There was a long silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock above the fridge. Then Zach said quietly, "You don't understand. I didn't mean—" But I turned. calm but resolute. "You didn't mean to get caught," I said, "but you meant every word, and even now I can see it. You're not sorry. You're confused, you're afraid, but you're not sorry, and that's the only thing I can't fix for you." I handed him an envelope. Inside was a bus ticket, one way, out of my house, out of the war he helped start. He looked at it stunned, and I said, "You have 1 week. I expect you gone by then." He left the table without another word, went upstairs and slammed the door. I heard things being moved, maybe packed, maybe just thrown in frustration. But I didn't follow. I didn't intervene. I sat at the table, surrounded by fragments of a life I had spent decades building, and I realized the most powerful thing I had left was not revenge or control. It was the ability to say, enough. And I had finally said it. The day Zach left, the weather was still and gray, the kind of overcast that makes shadows dissolve into the air and time feels suspended. He didn't say goodbye. I didn't ask him to. The suitcase he dragged down the steps bumped against each stair like punctuation in a sentence neither of us wanted to finish. He passed through the front door without looking back, his phone in one hand, earbuds in, a jacket too light for the breeze that had begun to pick up. I stood in the kitchen, not watching him go, but listening for the absence of his presence, the way the floorboards no longer creaked with his impatience, the way the hallway no longer carried the stifled sound of laughter from a screen or a whispered scheme over the phone. The silence that filled the house was not comforting, but clean. Empty, yes, but finally mine again. In the days that followed, I didn't tell anyone he had gone. Not David, not the neighbors, not the church ladies who occasionally called to check in with veiled curiosity and unsolicited advice. I simply returned to my routine, piece by piece, stitch by stitch, like repairing a frayed garment, not to make it new, but to keep it from unraveling. I brought out Margaret's tea set from storage and began using it again, not for guests, but for myself, a quiet declaration that the memory of her had not been evicted by the carelessness of a teenager who hadn't yet earned the weight of consequence. I returned to my walks. I returned to the books I'd been meaning to finish. I returned, in some way, to myself. David didn't call for weeks, which didn't surprise me. When he finally did, his voice was stiff, rehearsed, as if he'd prepared for a confrontation that never came. "Zach said he's back at school," he offered, as though that counted for something. I said nothing. He paused, then added, "He didn't tell me much, just that things didn't work out, that he, needed to go." I could hear the question he wanted to ask, but couldn't form, so I helped him. "I asked him to leave," I said plainly. He crossed a line I couldn't let stand. David didn't argue, for once. He seemed to understand, or at least understand that further protest would only expose his complicity. He didn't ask about the will. I think he already knew. We hung up soon after, and I didn't expect to hear from him again for some time. Then, 3 weeks later, something arrived. Not a call, not a visit, a letter, handwritten, trembling, unsure, from Zach. Just a single page, the ink smudged in places, the grammar uneven, as though he'd rewritten it several times and still wasn't sure it was good enough to send. He didn't apologize, not directly, but he wrote about Margaret, about the way she used to make him grilled cheese with 2 slices of tomato, and how she would hum while folding laundry. He wrote about the photo I showed him, the one of the 3 of us when he was a baby. He said he didn't remember the moment, but something about the way I looked at him in the picture scared him, because, in his words, "I don't think anyone's ever looked at me like that since." He didn't ask to come back. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for forgiveness. But he said he had started volunteering at a local senior center near his school, not for credit, not for community hours, but just to see if I could sit with someone who isn't me. And he signed it not with Zach, but your grandson, as though trying to reclaim a title he had nearly destroyed. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the same wooden box where Margaret's notes lived and sat with it for a while, staring out the window at the fading light. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just felt the weight of time again, but this time not as a burden, but as proof that I was still capable of being affected, of being heard, of mattering. I don't know what will become of Zach. I don't know if that letter marks a turning point or just a temporary flicker of self-awareness before he returns to the gravity of his father's influence. But I do know this. I didn't write him back. Not yet. Because sometimes silence is not punishment. It's a waiting space, a test, a quiet stretch of road where a boy must walk alone before he can truly arrive anywhere worth staying. And as for me, I have not become a walking corpse. I am flesh and memory and voice and fire not yet burned out. I walk this house not as a ghost, but as its last rightful guardian. And if they ever come again to take what was never theirs to begin with, they'll find the doors locked, the lights on, and the man inside very much alive.